Good morning. My name's James Smith. I'm Research Director here at the Resolution Foundation, and welcome to our pre-budget event, particularly to people who've battled here in person in the Westminster rain. That's all very impressive. Now, by any standards, this is going to be a big budget, a big historic budget, and that's what we like at the Resolution Foundation. So that's good news. But this is the first one that will be given by a Labour Chancellor in pushing 15 years, so seismic in political terms. And it'll also be the first one given by a woman. Sort of hoping for some cheering there. You know, we're in a sort of Westminster fiscal conversation when that goes a bit unmocked, but we're still waiting for that first Bank of England female governor. We've waited 800 years for a chancellor. We're only 300 years into that wait, so hopefully that'll be sorted out at some point. And in true sort of dancing backwards in heels style, all Rachel Reeves has to do in this budget is avoid returning to austerity, keep to those manifesto commitments not to raise tax, provide a boost to living standards, and avoid government debt spiralling out of control. And if that wasn't enough, on top of that, she has said she wants to move us into a new era of higher growth, higher investment, and push the economy forward on that basis. And that's what really makes this all a very difficult event. Doing that when things are so tricky on the fiscal side. So that's a lot. The reason you know this is a big fiscal event, though, is because the Resolution Foundation have produced a document. Now, we don't normally produce a document. Again, I was hoping for a bit of a new. That didn't quite get the excitement. But this is a big thing. And the first you'll hear from one of the authors of that report, Cara Pachiti, who's a senior economist here at the Resolution Foundation. But then we'll have a really great panel to get into the economics and politics of all this, because that is absolutely fascinating. So we'll hear next from Giles Wilkes, who's senior fellow at IFG, but in a previous life was special advisor to Theresa May for 2.5 years. You know, it's a hard job when they include the half year in the bio. So, but was also advisor to Vince Cable and has had other big think tank jobs. And then we will hear on the politics of all this from Eleni Carrere, who's political correspondent at The Guardian. Before being at The Guardian, she was helping to edit the SW1 Bible, the Politico London playbook, and was at The Times. So no one better to talk about the politics of all this as well. So as ever, you can get involved. We are taking questions on Slido. The hashtag is tough medicine. You see what the expectations management are coming in there. And we'll have microphones in the room for questions there as well. So without me rabbiting on anymore, over to Cara to tell you about the report.
Great, thanks, James. And before I start, I'd like to thank the other co-authors of this report, James and also Emily Fry. So as James has already said, it's an exciting budget coming up, and for once not just for us fiscal policy nerds, as it's a key milestone for the new government to set out their policy priorities for the Parliament. So there's a lot of expectation riding on this fiscal event. We've heard a lot from the Chancellor before the election about her ambitious plans to boost growth, and particularly business and public investment. You can see this quote here from her May's lecture back in March. But since the election, there's been a bleaker mood emerging from the Treasury. In July, the Chancellor unveiled a long list of additional spending pressures that she claimed would dramatically increase government borrowing this year, creating a £22 billion black hole, and spoke ominously of the difficult decisions to come at this budget. So there's a lot of anticipation and a big opportunity for the government to push forward their policy agenda, but also a growing sense of a particularly challenging fiscal picture. what will that fiscal picture actually look like? Well, I'm going to start with the OBR's forecast and what we might expect to see when they release their updated projections on budget day. So what's the bad news for the Chancellor? Well, essentially, this is what she was talking about back in July. It looks like some really significant overspends emerging this year compared to what the OBR projected would be spent by central government departments. So this chart here shows the monthly data the Office for National Statistics releases, which shows how much the government spends and receives in taxes every month, which we've here compared to what the OBR expected to be borrowed for each month. So looking cumulatively over the past 5 months, the purple bars here are the important ones, and they show that departmental spending has overshot OBR forecasts for the year so far by nearly £9 billion. So if the government continues to spend at that rate over the rest of the year, we would be pretty close to that £22 billion black hole that the Chancellor pointed to back in July. So while there's an ongoing row about who knew what when, there is some hard data to back up at least part of the Chancellor's claim on the very bleak outlook for the public finances for this year at least. And the significant overspends driving that higher borrowing are also in many areas that are likely to persist throughout the forecast. So things like public sector pay payments and asylum funding, which are going to likely cause borrowing pressure in future fiscal years as well. But there is some better news for the Chancellor that has emerged since March. So looking at the economy, inflation has proved sticky, not great news for consumers, but it has fallen more slowly than the OBR expected back in March. And this, coupled with slightly stronger real GDP growth in recent months, means that the forecast for nominal GDP is likely to be higher, we think, than the OBR projected back in March. And why is that good news? Bad news for consumers, good news for the government? It's because these are a key driver of the government's tax revenues. Even better, these positive developments for tax revenues have come about without substantially pushing up the expectations in markets for interest rates over the longer term, which would then have had knock-on impacts on debt interest costs. So taking all that together, we've got the overspending that's happening this year we expect to persist throughout the forecast, and also some of this higher growth and inflation. In this chart, we're showing what our best guess is of where the OBR might end up when it updates its economic and fiscal forecasts. So everything above the line here are factors which increase borrowing relative to the OBR's last forecast in March, and below the line are factors that decrease borrowing relative to that previous forecast. So these purple bars here are those high overspends identified this fiscal year, which you can see in our projection persists to the end of the forecast. And we've also got some light blue bars there that are some higher kind of other spending, primarily on welfare due to higher inflation than expected. Offsetting some of that higher spending in our scenario are these green bars, which show those higher tax receipts I mentioned flowing in due to stronger nominal GDP, and those reduced borrowing by about 16 billion by the end of our forecast. So taking all of that together in our central scenario, we're assuming that borrowing is around 12 billion higher than the OBR expected by the end of the forecast period. What would that mean for the current set of fiscal rules that the government have inherited? As a quick recap, Jeremy Hunt's key fiscal target was to have public sector net debt, excluding the Bank of England, falling as a share of the economy by the 5th year of the forecast. As you can see in this green line, he was narrowly meeting that target back in March by about £9 billion of fiscal headroom. In our updated scenario, which I've just talked through, that red line there, it is essentially flat and only falling by an extremely narrow margin of about £500 million. So if the OBR were to update their economic and fiscal forecast in the way that we're expecting here, that would essentially wipe out the Chancellor's headroom against the current fiscal rules, even before we get into any policy they might want to do. And it is also worth saying there's considerable uncertainty around these projections, not just in the assumptions we've made versus what the OBR will eventually decide to put into its forecasts, but also in terms of the longer-term economic outlook. The OBR have historically been extremely optimistic in terms of their forecasting of productivity compared to, for example, the Bank of England, as well as compared to outturns since the financial crisis. And if that productivity forecast was even moderately downgraded, in this scenario we'd instead see the fiscal rule being broken by £19 billion. There are also upside risks, so expectations for interest rates are still very volatile, and if those fell by a percentage point across the curve, the fiscal space in this metric would actually expand to around 14 billion. So overall, a challenging fiscal outlook with a lot of uncertainty looking ahead. So I've covered the hard times, now let's get back to the great expectations. Because against this very challenging fiscal backdrop, the government will still want to use this budget to make progress against some of the key policy aims it set itself. What are the government's priorities? Well, there's obviously a lot of people working very hard across the road trying to work that out. But basically what we've heard in the run-up to the election and as well as following it is there's three broad aims that have cropped up time and time again in the government's rhetoric. So the first is avoiding austerity. The Chancellor has repeatedly in interviews ruled out a return to the austerity that characterised the 2010s, although it's slightly opaque about what that means in practice, as I'll come back to. Second, during the election, the government committed not to raise the rates of any of the biggest revenue raisers for the Treasury: income tax, national insurance, VAT and corporation tax. And thirdly, much of the government's rhetoric in its first 100 days in government has focused on how to increase the UK's sluggish economic growth, with boosting investment identified as a key policy lever. It's obviously not the only lever you can use to try and boost growth. In previous work, we've also looked at, for the example of trade policies, skills policies, industrial strategy. But boosting investment is likely to be a crucial part of any convincing growth strategy for the UK, particularly following decades of underinvestment relative to our international peers. So a really packed agenda there, as James kind of set out on the intro. How do we think the government could achieve this? Well, let's look first at avoiding austerity. So this chart shows departmental day-to-day spending, that's the RDEL we're referring to in that label, in real terms and per capita. And it is also our scenario, which assumes those additional overspends that the Chancellor talked about back in July that we're expecting to see happen this year. And I should say here that we only have detailed plans for departmental spending set out for this year. The government will announce next year's settlement at the budget. We'll have to wait for spring to get a full multi-year spending review after that point. So this forecast currently relies on the spending assumption that Jeremy Hunt had in his forecasts for years after the spending review period, which was that departmental spending would rise by 1% in real terms. And looking at this overall measure, you might think that in terms of avoiding austerity, it essentially looks like, job done. Accounting for inflation and population growth, departmental spending is rising across the forecast, and it's a big contrast to the falls that we saw across the 2010s. So you might think, no austerity. But that's much true of some departments' experience than others. So here we're splitting out protected departments, so departments like health, education, defence, where the government have already stated certain commitments to spend a certain amount on them in the years ahead, and then the other departments, we're calling unprotected departments. So those protected departments are seeing much higher growth in the overall spending envelope, which then means, as a kind of the residual here, much steeper cuts to those other departments. So for example, justice, local government. This green line here shows cuts that total 23 billion by the end of our forecast, which, given we know about the creaking state of public finances, may feel a lot more like austerity for these bits of government. So what could the government do if it does want to avoid this? One option would be to increase departmental spending by more than that 1% in real terms. These lighter lines show what would happen if they instead committed to keeping departmental spending constant as a share of the economy, which eradicates, as you can see, most of those steep falls in that green line. However, this would cost them about £21 billion by the end of the forecast. Why might that be a problem? Well, we're expecting the government to introduce a new set of fiscal rules at this budget. I'll go into more detail on that later. But one of the rules they have committed to in advance is saying that they will balance the current budget, which is ensuring day-to-day spending is covered by tax revenues. So this chart shows that the government actually inherits a relatively strong current balance position by the end of the forecast. You can see the measure is below that zero, so it's in surplus by the end of the forecast. But not if we add in that additional spending to avoid those steep cuts in departmental spending, unprotected departmental budgets. So to bring that pink line there, which is showing what happens if you're wanting to kind of swerve austerity essentially, your government would need to introduce at least £20 billion of tax rises, or more like £20 to £30 billion if they wanted to maintain even the relatively slim margin of headroom the previous government held against their fiscal rules, which was around £9 billion. So tax rises in this budget are all but inevitable. So the question is then more, how will the government achieve those tax hikes of £20 to £30 billion without breaking its manifesto commitments on the main tax rates, the second policy aim here I mentioned? So the first thing to say is that in terms of scale, post-election tax rises here are not actually that far out of the ordinary. with average tax rises over the first two fiscal events after the past 8 elections amounting to around £21 billion. Which taxes should the government focus on? Well, if you're looking for bedtime reading, we've got you sorted out. There's a full report by my colleague Adam Corlett on what changes we think to the tax system would raise revenues while also making the tax system more efficient. And here we identify capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and employer national insurance contributions as key areas the government could focus on if it did want to raise that £20 billion. So we've covered the challenges facing the government in terms of day-to-day spending. But on top of that, we know that the government is really keen to boost capital spending to increase investment as part of its growth strategy, our final bullet here. Where did the government start out in terms of investment? Well, we've got some really sharp falls currently planned over the forecast, with net investment falling from 2.4% this year to well below 2% by the end of the forecast. If the government instead wanted to hold investment constant as a share of the economy, that would require a huge £30 billion of gross investment spending by the end of the forecast in our modelling. Now, borrowing to invest on that kind of scale of funding would actually be fine against our current balance rule, because it only looks at day-to-day spending, not capital spending. But the government have also committed to another fiscal target pre-election, which is to have debt falling. That's a lot more challenging in terms of borrowing to invest. Based on the definition that Jeremy Hunt used to set his fiscal rules, that would be broken by nearly £35 billion in our scenario. That dark green line there you can see is kind of rising off into the distance. Which is why then it's perhaps very unsurprising there's been a steady flow of rumours that the Chancellor is looking at changing this fiscal rule and adjusting the measure of debt that it focuses on to increase her ability to borrow to invest. What are our options here? There's some relatively small tweaks you could make to Jeremy Hunt's debt rule that would free up some fiscal headroom, and most of those relate to how we define the public sector bit of public sector net worth, so what we include in and out of the kind of wider public sector we consider when we're looking at these balance sheets. And the first is to move to a measure of debt that includes the Bank of England. So Jeremy Hunt's rule is excluding Bank of England, and that was initially due to some distortions created by the Bank of England's term funding scheme, which has since wound down by the end of the forecast. Due to some differences in how the fiscal flows relating to quantitative easing are captured in these measures, debt, including the Bank of England, is actually falling faster by the end of the forecast. That blue line is on a slightly faster downward trajectory than the red line, which looks basically flat here. Sorry, I know these are some tricky to see the differences in these very flat-looking lines. And that dark blue line, so moving to debt, including the Bank of England, would free up about £16 billion of fiscal headroom in our scenario. Another route the government could go down is to exclude other bodies from their definition of the public sector. There have been some media reports suggesting this could include excluding GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund from the public sector for their rules, allowing them to invest sort of off balance sheet through these bodies. This would increase their scope for investment through these specific channels, though it does give future chancellors an incentive to expand the use of these organisations purely to get around their fiscal rules. So a more radical option, we've moved to one of these kind of purple or green lines in our chart, which are various measures of the balance sheet which widen the set of assets and liabilities included in the government's measure of debt. And here there are broadly two options of broader balance sheet measures. If you spend too long around Westminster these days in this sort of bubble or sort of talking to the Treasury at the moment, you'll hear people talking about per snuffle or per snew. Those do admittedly sound like Sesame Street characters, but translated into more normal terms, we're talking about net financial liabilities, that's per snuffle, or public sector net worth, which is also known as per snew. And public sector net debt is actually, it's actually a pretty narrow measure of the balance sheet, capturing only the most sort of liquid financial assets and liabilities. Public sector net financial liabilities also then includes financial assets and liabilities deemed too illiquid to be included in debt. And that is sort of crucially relates to the assets created when the government issues loans. Because of that, public sector net financial liabilities does fall rapidly over the end of the forecast, as the high levels of student loans that are being issued and keep public sector net debt elevated are netted off against the assets that they incur when those loans are issued. And this leaves over £50 billion of headroom to borrow to invest under this measure, as well as expanding the government's scope to lend to private actors to invest. So that's one option for an expanded balance sheet measure. But our favourite option here at the Resolution Foundation is even broader than that. So public sector net worth, that green line there, on top of those liquid and illiquid financial assets, also includes non-financial assets. So for example, the roads, hospitals and buildings are created when the government invests. So the value of those are then added on to the balance sheet. And there's some key benefits to targeting this measure. So targeting a rise in public sector net worth incentivises the government to create public value through those assets it invests in, with investment spending essentially becoming fiscally neutral as that capital spending you're doing nets off against the asset it's used to create. Another benefit to this measure is that by explicitly recording their value on the public sector balance sheet, it also disincentivises the sale of those assets at below their actual value in the future. Along with the practicalities of targeting a new balance sheet measure, the Chancellor may have some pause for thought in moving to a metric that doesn't cap overall debt, which could therefore incur high debt interest costs in future. So we would expect if there was a move to one of these wider balance sheet measures to come with some kind of backup rule to limit the extent to which debt can rise. In the report, we suggest an investment target or cap that would explicitly set out how much the government was aiming to borrow to invest. So to conclude, even before we get into the government's quite ambitious looking policy agenda, there will likely be some tough news on the fiscal outlook, although projected overspends in this year will probably be partially offset by some stronger tax receipts in the OPR's forecasts. We can definitely expect some tax rises if the government wants to swerve austerity for unprotected departments and meet its current balance rule at the same time. And if they do want to borrow to invest, we'll need to see some changes in the fiscal framework, for which there are several different options of rules the government could adopt. There's a whole lot more in the full briefing online, but I'm going to leave it there and hand back to James.
Thank you, Cara. So that's a very clear setting out of what we're saying in the report. I felt like it was a bit of a tough crowd for your persnuffle and pursue gags, but they were very good. So over to Giles. How are you seeing things?
Thank you very much, James and Cara. I mean, that's a really tough presentation to follow, not least for the implicit requirement that we're clearly expected to put as many Dickens titles into our comments as we can. See if you can spot them as they come along. So yes, I mean, in my view, Rachel Reeves has inherited as difficult a situation as the one that the coalition inherited in 2010 when the budget deficit was £150 billion and we were all worried about a renewed euro crisis. I think there's just simply far less room for manoeuvre than this government. I mean, if you look at what the coalition government was able to do within that tough challenge of dealing with the fiscal deficit, it was also able to announce a roadmap cutting corporate taxes, raising the income tax threshold, a quite expensive triple lock on pensions. It was able to do goodies as well as just pure bad news. Here it feels like it's nothing but bad news. It's a choice of sort of different poisons all the way around. A few points I would make to sort of illustrate that, and one of the really valuable things in this excellent presentation I'm hoping you will all read afterwards, the black hole really is real. I mean, this is one of the things that if you meet the Labour advisors at the conference, they're absolutely convinced this isn't just theatre. The black hole really is real, and this is what you can see here in the evolving public finances data shows it, that the spending totals are coming in consistently higher that suggests the black hole really is real, which is a really wicked problem to deal with. When your current spending is already off track and it's likely to roll forward, as Cara made clear, then that gives you an immediate starting point behind the starting line, which is extremely difficult to deal with. So that sort of change of tone you saw from Rachel Reeves in the early weeks of this government, which suggested real sort of anger, it got quite sort of nasty immediately. I think it isn't feigned. It's not the sort of thing you want to inherit as a government. So there's a classic trilemma that the government faces. It's between its admittedly politically chosen tax commitments that it felt it needed to make, the need to repair public finances and get growth going, so in other words, do great things with the spending. And then finally, the essential commitment that every government needs to make nowadays, which is to not be like Liz Truss, and therefore sort of stick to something that the gilt market or the borrowing markets or whatever it is out there that we're trying to reassure is happy enough about. Now, I personally think that, I mean, obviously Liz Truss did a lot of damage, not least to her own party, but one of the problems she really caused is it vindicated the Treasury almost too much. In my view, our concerns about being able to take a little bit more leeway with borrowing became exaggerated when somebody produced such a cocktail of bad policies in a single statement. It meant that people could say, but you don't want to be like Liz Truss, is the permanent argument. And I'm worried slightly that this is going to go with the already inherently hawkish attitude of the Chancellor to make it harder to do some of the adventurous stuff. But anyway, I would say that fiscal challenge, which has been laid out so superbly, that's one of the two really big things that Rachel Reeves has to deal with. The other one, I would say, is more political and economic and sort of growth-based, which is to prove Michael Gove wrong, where he said that what has been revealed in the early weeks of this government is that Labour does not have a political economy of its own. Now, that's a really serious charge. Nobody voted for such a monumental change and hundreds of Conservative MPs out and hundreds of new Labour MPs. For Rachel Reeves to be merely Jeremy Hunt plus a little bit more honesty about the fiscal deficit and a little less requirement to be nice to Mark Francois and Jacob Rees-Mogg. Admittedly, I think I would settle for that because actually the requirement to do stupid things to please people who always want tax cuts, who always want a worse relationship with Europe, has been a real problem for our growth. But Reeves needs to show that she's more than just that there is also a philosophy that enables you to take choices differently and actually get us out of this hole. So for most of my talk, I'm going to just say what I think that philosophy should be, because the fiscal side has been so laid out so well. I don't think there's very much we can add, and we can do that in Q&A. But how are they being different? How can they prove Gove is wrong? Well, number one is on this investment thing. Jeremy Hunt has set out a pathway for capital investment falling from 2.4 to 1.7%. And I believe that this government really doesn't want to see that. I mean, you can't be a pro-investment government and be cutting really CapEx that hard. So it's much more willing to look at borrowing to invest. I also think that this is a government that's willing to contemplate bargains that I always shorthand in my school notes as 2002 bargains. This is where the Chancellor stands up in front of everybody and says, I am going to raise a tax in order to do a thing that you all want to happen. In this case, it was Gordon Brown and putting money into the NHS. This is a government that, if it doesn't do it in this budget, is going to do it at some future budget, I hope, where it says, look, we understand that you will trust us if we do things with the money that you want us to happen. The second one, which is the other thing you're going to speed reading apart from great expectations in hard times, is the industrial strategy document that came out about an hour ago. The last government was quite industrial strategy based. There is an appalling Twitter thread I put out about a year ago of all the industrial strategy things that the last government was doing. The life sciences vision, the advanced manufacturing plan, and innovation strategy, a 20-year plan for CCUS, quantum technologies, a science and technology framework, lots and lots of different things. But it wasn't ever quite able to admit that it was doing industrial strategy. The document that's just come out from the government is the first really good theoretical framework for why you do industrial strategy for a long time. I would say it beats the one that we did during the 2 years, 6 months, 12 days and 4 hours I spent as Theresa May's special advisor. Because I think it's much more. Time flies. It was what wonderful times. But it's much more about the really tough choices you've got to make. If you have industrial strategy, it's just open for all comers that says, look, we hear you, we've really messed up with productivity, come to us with your plans. That's great. Industry would rather you said that than not. But they also need to know about the tough choices, the sectors that are not essential for industrial strategy, like, as our mutual friend Torsten Bell said in his Ending Stagnation thing. Oh, we don't speak his name. Oh, sorry. The hospitality sector, for example, in Ending Stagnation, you guys made it clear that maybe some sectors have got too much employment. That sort of tough choice needs to be part of the industrial strategy, and I think the document that's come out there is one of the answers. Another thing that you'll see in that, I think, is a much greater emphasis on institutions amongst the sort of Labour thinking. So, in other words, when you build an institution, it can shape a market. It can provide impulse to a market, like the National Wealth Fund or Great British Energy might do. But it can also sort of change the rules. I mean, one of the changes of an institution, for example, is, again, a really clear statement in He Who Should Not Be Named's book, is that if you maybe make employment regulations slightly tougher, you may provide employees with greater confidence to change jobs and end the low dynamism problem that you've got in this country. That's, again, a Labour kind of choice that is not the sort of thing that you'd take if you were a Conservative government. And finally, the idea that stronger public services are necessary for growth. Not just, oh, we're going to cut public services, but then we'll get growth going, and then eventually we'll get some money for public services, which seemed to be the Liz Truss approach. But if you've got weak skills, if you've got weak health, if you've got weak infrastructure, you can't grow. So you do need to make sure that public services are working first before you can claim to have a basis for growth. So that's what I'm hoping that we get from the budget, as well as a statement for how to deal with that trilemma. Lord knows if she's going to get there. I was very worried. I mean, one of the first quotes that you put, Cara, in your presentation was that thing, if we can't afford it, we can't do it. Keynes famously said, if we can do it, we can afford to do it, which was much pithier and more counterintuitive and more Keynesian. And I do hope that she's not going to be too stuck on that sort of we can't afford everything line. Anyway, on that hopeful note, that's my original. Those are my initial thoughts.
Great, thanks, Giles.
Cheers.
So you heard it here first. The main aim for this government is to prove Michael Gove wrong. That should be the aim of any government. Eleni, how are you seeing this budget?
So I'll speak for a few minutes just about the political context of the budget and the political challenges facing the government as we approach it. It's important, I mean, first of all, as we get close to the budget, to remember that Labour's had a really tricky start and a really tricky first 100 days. For a real combination of reasons. I mean, we've had just the events, so the need to tackle the riots that happened after the Southport attacks, the sort of freebie scandal that dogged Keir Starmer and his cabinet for a few weeks, and the kind of revelations around that. But also more broadly, the fact that, we had the general election, and then quite soon afterwards we had summer recess, then government came back when Parliament came back in early September, and then another recess for conferences. So there's really been quite a stop-start nature to things so far. And one of the legacies of Liz Truss, actually, is the fact that, combined with that, we haven't been able to have Labour announce a budget very soon in its government after winning the election. So we've spoken a bit about 97 and more about 2010. In both those instances, soon after winning the general elections, New Labour and then the coalition government had budgets the month after winning. So they won elections in May, and then they set the narrative with budgets in June. Now, this government hasn't been able to do that, partly because of the timing, but also because of the need to give the OBR 10 weeks as part of the sort of Liz Truss lock that they've committed to. So it just means that the budget now that we're going to have on the 30th of October isn't really so much about setting the narrative, it's about resetting the narrative and kind of giving Labour a fresh start, kind of trying to move past the difficulties that they've had in the first 100 days, which we've seen have really affected them, in the polls, have really affected Keir Starmer's approval ratings, which have really plummeted. And that's something that, speaking to people around him, they're actually worried about. So this is a really kind of unique and important political opportunity for them to reset that narrative. And they're very, very conscious of that moment, to kind of use the moment politically to capture voters' attention. And in order to do that, they're going to have to offer a semblance of hope, a message of hope. I mean, a key thing about these first 100 days that we've had has been this sort of doom and gloom narrative, which is kind of continuing, because it really is a very difficult inheritance and a really difficult situation that they're facing. But there's been a lot of complaints, both from the political side, from MPs, but also, there's been concerns that it's damaged things economically, it's discouraged businesses as well. Lots of there's kind of need and desire to inject a kind of more positive message and a more hopeful message, and kind of shift a little bit from that kind of doom and gloom narrative, which, as we've sort of as the panel's already touched upon, is partly being kind of used to emulate Osborne and Cameron in 2010 in their desire to kind of pile the blame on Gordon Brown's handling of the financial crisis. Similarly, Labour has so far been trying to really kind of emphasise that the very real problems that they're facing are the fault of the previous Conservative governments. So it's a really tricky political challenge for them, both having to deal with these very, very kind of big financial challenges while injecting a kind of sense of hope and positivity. Now, one part of the answer to that is a kind of the first inklings that we will get of them talking about wanting to improve public services, and that we've had some suggestions already in Keir Starmer's speeches and Rachel Reeves' speeches that there will be more money for health, for the NHS, and for education. So that's going to be I think that will likely be one of the themes, but that also comes with some challenges in that, there will always be sectors of ministers that will be disappointed with what they come out from the budget. And, these first few months of the Labour government have been, partly because of the kind of long lead up to the budget, they've been characterised by a lot of lobbying towards Darren Jones and Rachel Reeves from sort of ambitious cabinet ministers who want more money for their departments, and not everybody's going to be happy. So coming out of the budget, that will be a political challenge for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to contend with. And the other thing we've discussed a bit, and I should touch upon, is obviously growth as a kind of political central mission of this government, which they've actually is so much of a kind of central aspect of what they're doing is that they've made a pledge which was to make the UK the fastest growing economy in the G7, which is very early on, as soon as they made it, was seen by many people as a mistake because it's something that they can't necessarily, they can't control other countries' elements of growth. And obviously business investment is really central to achieving that. And the kind of challenge that Labour is also facing, which we haven't really spoken about so far, is the fact that because of the constraints that they've placed on themselves when it comes to which taxes they won't raise, a lot of the tax rises, as this report also touches upon, are likely to affect businesses and kind of juggling the fact that they're relying on businesses for that growth agenda largely, and the fact that they're expected to hit businesses in tax rises in this first budget is going to be quite difficult. Now, as the Resolution Foundation has talked about, one of the taxes that they are actually actively considering is levying national insurance on employers' pension contributions, and that combined with potentially increasing employers' national insurance contributions in general is likely to be seen as a kind of, if they do go down that route, likely to be seen as a kind of double tax on businesses. Certainly the Tories will want to present it as that. But, it's the kind of thing that because they're so limited in what they can do because of the pledges that they've made, it's a challenge that they're going to have to contend with. And the Tory tax are likely to come with that. Yeah, so that's all.
All right, thank you very much. Great. All right, so we're going to take the discussion really in two parts here. So we're going to do a bit on tax and spend and austerity and all those lovely things, and then we're going to talk a bit about growth. So a reminder that if you want to ask questions, Slido is the place to do that. But if you have tax and spend questions in the room, get ready to put your hands up as well. So that'll be sort of part of all this. I'm hoping we can bring up the first poll here. So we're going to ask everyone what their views are on tax and spend and what the Chancellor should actually be doing. So there's a lot of words here, so do pay attention. But this basically boils down to how should the Chancellor respond to the fact that there's 20 billion of essentially, as Cara was telling us, austerity built into the plans. Steady with the voting. I know it's very exciting. So should she just continue with those cuts to unprotected departments? Should she reverse them and pay for it with higher taxes? Should she pay for it by cutting welfare? Should she pay for it by borrowing more? Or should she do some combination of all of those things? So as we're talking about tax and spend, do have your say on how the Chancellor should play it. But I wanted to just start by picking up on what Giles was saying about the inheritance. Now, you've said this is the worse inheritance than the coalition government. The government have said it's the worst since the Second World War. Now, where would you stand on that? Is that a fair statement? I mean, in what sense that might be true?
We're all fanboys of different terrible years. I mean, I personally have a little poster of 1974 on my bedroom. I think that one. I mean, there's a fantastic Rest is History episode all about this one absolutely grim year. So I would still say 1974 was my absolute worst, and also some of the post-war austerity years were dreadful. GDP debt to GDP was over 200%. and there was rationing, and the Americans had cut off the overseas channel, and we had an immediate fiscal sterling crisis in 1949, and Stafford Cripps became the Chancellor, like the meanest spirited looking man you could ever see announcing things, and yet they managed to create the NHS and so forth. So I would say it isn't the very worst. I think the very worst kind of shocks you can get are absolutely massive energy shocks when you've got inelastic demand for energy. And 1974 was an absolute killer there. If they'd taken over in the middle of 2022, I think that might have been a worse inheritance perhaps, but it is still terrible, and in particular because of an invisible thing, which everyone can see the fiscal deficit. You can get printed and modelled and put on charts. The amount of money you need to keep your public services working versus the amount they actually have is an invisible problem in that nobody knows exactly what that number is. All we know is it's a lot more than we currently have. And I think in a sense that's what makes it so much more wicked now than 2010. Because in 2010 public services were working.
Right, so we'd actually have to have a return to rationing for it to be the worst.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can do better than that. I wanted to talk a bit about the politics of all this. So I'm going to take a suspiciously anonymous question from Slido to look at this. I'm going to start with Eleni on this one. So this question is basically saying, should the new government carry on with the old government's approach to fiscal events in terms of really trying to manage expectations down, and can they do something a bit more positive with the public finance? And only you were talking about good things on public services. So in terms of a political strategy here, so we have a tried and tested approach of raising taxes after elections, getting the bad news out of the way. Should this government be aiming for lots and lots of tax bad news to get us some of that, some of the good stuff on public services? What are they doing, and what should they be doing in terms of the politics of all this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the kind of rhetoric, there's a lot of actually internal unhappiness about the government adopting Tory rhetoric on economics. I mean, the reason they have is because that's how they calculated they were going to win the election, particularly in the context of Liz Truss and the Tories losing from their part their reputation for fiscal responsibility. Labour wanted to be the kind of adopt the identity of the party of fiscal responsibility. But it is a Labour Party, and fundamentally it touches on what Giles was saying about because of the rhetoric and the kind of narrative that they've adopted in the run-up to the election, it's not quite clear what their own economic agenda is, what their grand vision for the economy is, and how that differs from the Tories. So yes, I mean, I think it's an unenviable. I mean, we're talking about how kind of whether it's the worst since the Second World War inheritance that they face. So this is going to be a difficult budget, and they will probably have to combine, bring out some tax rises together with public services. Perhaps it's one idea is to do something where you're saying we're going to have to raise these taxes in order to pay for these things. Kind of create a direct link between the two in order to kind of say to the public, this is how we're paying for this. But I think it's a really interesting question when it comes to the rhetoric, and whether I think there is a need for Labour to kind of come up with its own way of talking about things, something that's evocative and that captures the public imagination. I mean, the other thing I'd add on this is you hear Labour people speaking enviously about the way that David Cameron used to talk about managing the economy as if it was a household budget, and the way that really made people. That's something that everybody can understand, and I feel like Labour hasn't really found its equivalent. This government hasn't really found an equivalent of way of talking about the economy that people can understand. That is a kind of unique Labour way of doing so.
All right, I'm not going to have a rant about how helpful that was about things, but it was not helpful. Anyway, so can I just push you a little bit though, in terms of choosing between big load of tax now with some more spending. What do you think? What do you think they should be doing? And then I'm going to ask Giles how that conversation went in the coalition days.
I guess from a kind of politics perspective and the way that things get land in the media and land with the voters, generally the best thing to do is to get the pain in early before. I mean, that's kind of what they've done with the winter fuel allowance as well, cutting that. That's part of the thinking is we're not going to have another election for a long time. So getting the pain in early on and then allowing people to forget about it kind of in the coming years and doing more stuff that is popular is the way to kind of go about things.
So looking back to your time, I suppose also thinking about the austerity period, do you think that the approach was the same? You touched a bit in your introductory remarks, Giles, on it not being entirely about pain. What's the right approach for the situation we have?
So if you're interested in there are great differences between 2010 and 2024. One of them is that I believe Elena just referred to cabinet ministers lobbying to have more money. Back in 2010, they were competing to look who was the hardest and settle quickest, so that they could be in the star chamber adjudicating the other people. I don't know if you're old enough to remember this appalling dance of like DCMS and DCLG both trying to settle really, really quickly, not worrying about, 5 and 10 years' time, will the social care system fall over? No, they weren't thinking about that. They were thinking, I want to settle early so that I can then be adjudicating in the star chamber with the other departments. So the philosophy towards public spending cuts was entirely different. Whereas now we do need ministers who think in terms of in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, will the public services that I'm the custodian of not be falling over? So I think that's a really key difference. I mean, as for approaching the right approach, I mean, in answer to this question that we have in front of us here, Labour, each time Labour's been thrown out for more than a decade, it's followed a period where it looked like they'd lost control of things, mostly financially. In particular, the last two times, there was 1976, an IMF waved over them, and the financial crisis and the fiscal deficit waved over them. And as a result, we got 18 years and 14 years of Conservative government, which in Labour minds caused a great deal of damage. So if you were asking why adopt this particular there are tough choices, the rhetoric, it's precisely because Labour has to work a lot harder to keep its credibility in those periods. The public instinctively thinks that Labour politicians want to spend more, want to, that's their stakeholder group. And tough times actually suit Conservative approaches better in a funny way. One of my feelings about the coalition is that the slowdown that hit us from 2011 to 2013 in the end suited the Conservative political mindset better. Because if they had got all the fiscal challenges out of the way in 2014 or 15, it would have meant that Labour could say, look, we've now got some choices and we'd like to do these nice things with it. As it was, George Osborne and others were able to say, look, we've got more tough times to come, and that lot don't have an answer. So I do think that there's a reason that the Rachel Reeves needs to own the tough choices rhetoric a little bit in order that she can then do a few tough things, probably on the tax side. But otherwise, in terms of the right approach, we're going to move on to things like fiscal rules, no doubt.
I mean, you and I are so in tune here. I was just about to say, we're going to talk about fiscal rules. I'm going to ask Cara about what fiscal rules are doing in this tax and spend world. I'm going to bring up a question. There's a lot of questions on Slido about tax. So we're going to talk a bit about tax, not too much. We're going to talk about fiscal rules, not too much. Stay with me, people. This is not for everyone. And for people in the audience who have questions about tax and spend, get yourselves at the ready. We'll come to you in a moment. But Cara, on the can you just sort of set out what the government's fiscal rules are doing on tax and spend? And for people who sort of think to themselves, fiscal rules, they're just, they get changed all the time. They are just self-imposed things. Why do we even bother with them? Is it a good idea, what they're doing in terms of the tax and spend type rules?
Yeah, so I guess the key bit on the sort of day-to-day tax and spending, the key element where fiscal rules having a real influence on what they might do is that they've committed to this current balance rule. I think it's quite interesting how that sits with the discussion we're just having on sort of rhetoric, because I think this idea that you have to balance your day-to-day spending with your kind of tax take has a lot of intuitive appeal for people. It's the idea that, you're allowed to borrow for capital spending because that creates these assets that will still be there when you're taxing people to pay for your debt that you've created and you've borrowed for. And obviously we know that's a bit of an oversimplification. That's not quite true, and that day-to-day spending also has kind of long-term effects, as we're seeing in terms of austerity. Cutting now means you're creaking public services in future, and also it's the case that just because you're balancing your day-to-day tax take and your day-to-day spending now doesn't necessarily mean that's enough in future if those pressures are building over time, or there's economic shocks. So you might want to do more than that. But I think the really key thing sort of strategically is that it does push the government into a position of, if it wants to spend more on departmental budgets, it either needs to tax more or it needs to cut other spending. And the thing we've not really talked about so far is that there's this whole other category of spending that's not departmental spending and is spending that's kind of annually managed because it's quite hard to predict. That's mainly debt interest and welfare payments. So there is, the other option for a government in this situation would be to look at how you reduce, particularly here, welfare spending. There's not much you can do about debt interest costs. The reasons we don't think that's an approach the government has kind of open to it is that actually looking at its sort of welfare spending budgets, one of the areas that have increased most rapidly, particularly sort of disability benefits, but they're already got some quite tough decisions baked into those forecasts already that I think we think the government probably won't want to be taking. So some reforms to the disability system that are looking quite punitive, very complex to implement, are really not saving them that much money in the forecasts either. And on top of that, there's other aspects of the welfare system that are currently saving them money, things like the 2-child limit that we know there's a lot of pressure on them to remove to lift hundreds of thousands of children out of child poverty. And things like local housing allowance, which has not got a lot of kind of focus in the debate so far, but the rates used to set the support that renters get for their housing costs from next year onwards will be set using data that's from, I think, back in September 2023. Anyone renting in the room will know that rents have absolutely spiralled since then. And currently in the forecasts, those rates are just supposed to be frozen. And obviously that's not sustainable over 5 years for people, given how much rents will rise over that time.
Was that a groan from Giles at Amy spending, just a general?
It's hard to say the word Amy spending without a little groan, but it's there aren't easy options there. I just totally agree. Partly I totally agree because I'm an avid reader of Resolution Foundation output. So, but it is something that you will hear. You'll hear two reasonable points from sort of thoughtful centre-right commentators. One is that, at some point we need to be addressing that Amy spending, but the way to address it is through investment in the underlying causes to lower the demand on it. And two, that public sector productivity has taken a hell of a hit in the last 5 years. And when people accuse the last chancellor of leaving behind unaffordably small public spending totals, it's because he was assuming that we can be more aggressive in achieving public sector productivity. Again, there's a horse and cart argument to be had about which one you achieve first.
So I think sort of putting those together, there's a sensible rule here, but it means some tough things. So it means some rises in taxes. Now, Eleni, so let's not do a whole deep dive on tax, but what should the government's approach be on tax? Who should it be aiming to, who should it be thinking about when it's choosing tax rise? And I'm going to ask Cara to give a summary of the Resolution Foundation thinking on this, where the issue of employees' national insurance, you have to be very careful with this, is sort of bouncing around. So approach on.
So two things I'd mention. The obvious thing and the thing that any Labour government would do would be tax the wealthy. But we've seen some of the challenges of that. Around the non-dom changes that Labour wanted to make. It's been reported. Actually, The Guardian reported that.
Very good.
One of my colleagues. That it turns out that the government, the Treasury, is worried that the OBR is going to say that closing the non-dom loopholes that Rachel Reeves intended to close would actually cost money because of people leaving the country. So they're now rethinking that. That just shows you the challenge that the government is facing. And it's the same with capital gains tax, which are looking at increasing. And they're modelling, again, The Guardian reported that they're modelling some pretty big increases in capital gains.
All the scoops from one place.
exactly. But again, there are real concerns that if you raise CGT a lot, then that would actually be very counterproductive. So I mean, I'm sure Clara can tell us more about that. But those kind of examples show you the challenge of raising taxes that would affect the wealthy most of all. And going on to what I touched upon earlier, taxing businesses, taxing employers, that's something that we think that the Treasury is considering. Keir Starmer refused to rule out raising employers' national insurance contributions at Prime Minister's questions last week. Very specifically refused to rule it out. And since then, Johnny Reynolds has made it clear that Labour's manifesto commitment not to raise ANI only applies to working people. So that's an area where the government is looking at, but it's the kind of thing that the businesses that are at the investment summit today will be warning them not to do. So they face a difficult challenge there.
Right, Cara, how should people think about what's going on with tax?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of what does it make sense is quite an interesting way to frame it. And I guess when we've been thinking about what tax rises would be good options for the government, it's about not just kind of what's going to bring in revenue, but also, how can you design tax rises that will also make your tax system more efficient or make more sense essentially to people. And those are probably, I guess, maybe easier to justify politically as well. I'll leave that to Lainey. And I guess from our perspective, a lot of that's about sort of equalising how different forms of income are taxed. So we've written quite a lot about capital gains tax and proposed a lot of things like taxing marginal rates for shares, close to the rate for dividends, or taxing property gains like wages. So we're trying to kind of equalise and create kind of more fairness around how different forms of income are taxed. Although, as you said, there is worries about how if you do kind of hike these taxes, you do then see kind of more avoidance of those taxes. So I think we've also proposed closing of loopholes around capital gains tax. So things like exit charges might also be needed if you're going to really focus on trying to use capital gains tax to raise revenue. I guess some of this is talking about employers' national insurance. That's another area where we've been thinking it's probably more about sort of equalising how employees and employers are paying taxes. So our proposal there was levelling employer national insurance on employer pension contributions with a sort of corresponding relief for employee pension contributions. But yeah, I would suggest reading the actual detailed report on this one rather than my quick summary of it there.
All right.
But yeah.
Very good. Now, can we bring up the results of the poll? Now, is there anyone in the room with a burning tax and spend question? People, wow, that hand went up very quickly from David. So we'll do one from David and one from Andy King. We only have named audience members here, but just on this, in terms of the what you've chosen. Is not to pay for ending austerity with welfare cuts. So we're at a good RF event. That's you've all passed the test on that. But to do a combination of things, but that could include welfare cuts. It could include other spending cuts. It could include raising taxes. All right, but there's not a lot of support for continuing with the cuts. All right, question.
Simple question. Do you think Rachel Reeves has to announce everything October 30 with no reference to future direction of travel, dreaded royal commissions, etc.? And particularly this regard to, she mentioned, CGT reform, pensions tax reform. We know CGT is a mess. Yeah? We know all the experts say, don't just raise a rate, you've got to change the base. Pension tax reform, highly complex. But there's obviously a massive dilemma, which is if you kind of announce direction of travel, you distort behaviour now. Royal Commission's nothing ever, just years of talk. Yeah. Which way do you think she go? And do you see her in any event saying, I've got a direction of travel or I've got a way to go, but I'm not announcing the changes October 30?
All right, let's take the other question here. If you can say your name, Andy, that would be helpful at the start, whoever you are.
Thanks, James. I'm Andy. Andy King, former OBR and consultant these days. I just wanted to ask, there's a 20 billion, like your question just there was, there's a 20 billion black hole or a 20 billion hole to fill. And one of the options was not reverse the £20 billion tax cut that was announced by Jeremy Hunt, which was paid for by fictional public spending plans. And it's changing those fictional public spending plans is one of the most important reasons why there's a hole. And so I've been slightly surprised that neither yourselves nor the IFS and the Green Budget kind of led with, unfortunately, that commitment in the manifesto not to reverse those tax cuts. It's not affordable. It can't hold.
All right.
So instead, there's going to be some quite risky tax rises.
All right. Cara's going to take that, but let's start with this. Should we just get everything out of the way, Giles? What's your thoughts on that? There was another groan audible, I have to say.
I mean, no, I think it's...
Is it just Monday morning, Giles?
No, I thought, darn, I was hoping for an easy question. I think it's a really important point. I'm not quite old enough to have been an economic actor at the time of this, but in 1988, when they announced the end of a mortgage interest relief of some kind, but in 6 months' time, it presaged the biggest housing boom in our history and the crash that followed. So getting this sort of stuff wrong is incredibly important. I would just hope that it's only a key part. I mean, to put it rather dully, presumably the Treasury can analyse the likely behavioural responses to different sort of changes in CGT rates, such that you don't suddenly get everybody heading to the stock market and selling at once. But I do think it's a very important point that people will react rationally to any kind of upcoming tax statements. Can I just comment quickly on Andy's statement there? Because I brought this up in a podcast before the election with Paul Johnson of the IFS. I said, surely we know these NICS cuts are not affordable. Shouldn't Rachel Reeves, after the election, simply say, these are not affordable. As a result, we're going to bring them in much later once they become affordable. In other words, delay their imposition. And Paul went a colour that I've never seen anyone go in the natural world. He said this would be, you can look it up on the podcast yourselves, this would be the most outrageous thing that ever happened. Here we are, think tanks, warning that you're not being honest about the fiscal thing. And then you come after the election saying, oh, now we found out about it. Were you not listening to us before? So I think the IFS and others would say it's dishonest to have not done this when you... to have not gone through with these NICS cuts when you knew they weren't affordable and we were telling you. So I think it might still have produced a political problem. I personally agree with you that we're not in a fiscal crisis, we're in a political crisis where the political commitments have meant things don't seem affordable when they would have been affordable on the tax rates 2 years ago. So I agree with you. It's just every time I've worked for government, it then crashed and burned at the next election. So it tells you about the quality of my political advice.
All right. Okay. Wow. So as Cara has a go at this as well, I don't. You can be quite as stark as Giles was on that one. Perhaps we can bring up the next poll. We can sort of do those at the same time. But on Andy's point about national insurance.
Yeah, no, I think I've broadly agreed with what Giles said there. In terms of like, was that a good tax cut? I mean, by the sort of metric we were talking about before, like, did it actually improve the tax system? I think ourselves and some others were actually relatively positive about choosing to focus tax cuts on national insurance, because you are then kind of cutting taxes on working people rather than income tax, where you would be cutting taxes for sort of everyone. And we know that sort of working people have seen a kind of higher tax burden than other demographic groups. But was it affordable? I think we were pretty clear in saying no, definitely not at that point, and we've seen the fiscal position has got much worse. But yeah, our approach here was looking at what has the government committed themselves to, and then how could they deal with that. But as you say, those commitments, particularly on not increasing the rates of the biggest tax revenue raisers, do make that position much more difficult.
All right, so we're gonna switch to talking. Well, we're gonna talk a bit more about fiscal rules, I'm afraid. But again, we'll keep this painless. So do stay with me. So the next poll is gonna ask. What should this is not my drafting, but anyway, what should the Chancellor's lodestar fiscal rule be? So what is the kind of key fiscal rule? So the first option would be Jeremy Hunt's measure of debt, excluding the Bank of England. Should the new government just adopt exactly the same rule? Second option you're being offered here is the tweaked version that Cara told you about, to include the Bank of England. And then we've got options that exclude the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy, so that's a wheeze to do a bit more investment, but to do it through those vehicles, or to do something a bit more radical. So as Cara was telling you, these PSNUFL and PSNU rules, these that take account of assets as well as debt. Should the new government adopt one of those, or should we just shut up about fiscal rules? It's all too painful, and this is all that's wrong with the world. So, vote on that. I'm gonna start with Cara and asking her just to explain why. What can changing this rule do in the context of the government really making a lot about debt, but. While she does that, people in the audience who have questions in this space do have a bit of or other questions as we're heading towards the end of the time. Have a bit of a think about that, and we'll talk a bit about the politics too. Sorry, Cara.
Yes, I think, there is a debate out there, like to look at the kind of last poll option there, people say, why do we even have fiscal rules to start with? What's the point? And it's a tricky question because fiscal sustainability is just a really hard thing to define, right? You're trying to look for the point at which, investors are going to not want to buy your government debt and avoid that point, but keep borrowing kind of as much as you can do to do the things you want to do in the meantime. Knowing how fiscally sustainable kind of people think you are is really tricky and depends on a load of other factors, like Giles was saying with the Liz Truss scenario. A lot of those factors kind of came together. It wasn't just about the kind of scale of tax rises or how much she said she was going to borrow. So basically it's just really hard to define what fiscal sustainability is, so these rules always end up being kind of slightly blunt tools. And what we've ended up looking at mostly in these fiscal frameworks is debt, because it is, a pretty terrible measure of the balance sheet. It's a really, really narrow, like I said, but it is a pretty good measure of, the amount of debt you're issuing and how much you're going to have to pay interest on in future. So like a very narrow measure of fiscal sustainability would be like, you should just stick with debt because, that's the thing that's going to really, really blow your fiscal positions if you have to pay all this debt interest in the future. The problem with that is that, as we've seen over the 2010s, is that it really incentivizes you not to spend money to invest. And given we've been sort of underinvesting for decades, that can have knock-on impacts on sort of growth as well. So what, the key role, or a really important role of fiscal rules, is for government to kind of set out to the markets what it is they want to do and give a really clear sense of where their fiscal policy is going. And in the case of this government, it does sound like what they want to do is tell the markets that they want to borrow to invest. And it does sound like that probably does mean changing their fiscal rules, moving away from this focus just on we're going to get debt down, we're going to try and reduce the risk of high debt interest costs in the future, and instead look at some kind of metric that allows them to do a bit more investment and make that kind of statement to the financial markets.
So part of the fun choices for Rachel Reeves here is to choose between a fiscal rule that lets you do more investment, but also comes with potentially some of those sort of Liz Truss higher debt risk. Giles, you sort of raised the question of the kind of radical things that this government could do. What are the sensible radical things here, and what does that mean for the sort of fiscal rule? What's a very, very radical thing, but also very, very safe thing that they
Yeah, radical but safe. Okay, radical but safe. I would go for a combination of your fourth and fifth bullet point, which is PSNUFL, because it sounds so cool, but also sounds more rational in that we're not like we don't have bailiffs knocking on the door saying sell your stuff and pay us back immediately. Anything that's remotely got some kind of a vaguely financial assets like quality coming down the road, it should be good enough for markets. I think public sector net worth is more difficult because it's like long-term assets that are not necessarily saleable. But I mentioned the fifth because I wrote a piece about fiscal rules 15 years ago, so dull that the internet has scrubbed all memory of it. But it is out there called Fiscal Rules OK. And it was when the OBR was set up, and I was concerned that we were losing discretion and that the Conservatives were going to use the OBR as an excuse to sort of hard code in a hawkish attitude all the time. And I thought fiscal policy is ultimately very, very political, and it's judgmental. The reason Liz Truss was making a big mistake in 2022 wasn't just about the course of the fiscal aggregates, but it was the state of the economy at the time, the sharply rising interest rates that were happening, the fact that at the time we didn't know where gas prices were going to peak. All these conditional situational issues, which meant that anyone being say, "Oh, I did this because of a rule," is going to be ignoring those kind of conditions. Why were we adopting the same rule towards investment when interest rates were 1% as when they were 4.5%? So we do need to keep some discretion, which is why I would say it would be quite radical for a government to have a fiscal rule, but to be quite a long way from breaching it, so that we're not constantly in the position where one small change to the financial forecast means that we suddenly have to hurry around and then we cut investment. So it would be radical for the government to adopt a policy that left a lot of leeway, and then the Chancellor can't just turn and point at the rule and use that as the reason for not doing things or doing things, but has to say it's because my judgment and our analysis suggests this is a good or a bad idea. That would be quite radical.
All right. Now, I'm going to show you the top voted up question with a whole 2 endorsements. I'm gonna send this to Eleni first. So, what I'm really looking for here is a sort of, which basically says what is one fiscal rule that the government should set here. Now, and I suppose what I'm really interested in here is, you know, the before the election, Rachel Reeves was very clear she would have a debt falling rule. Now she seems to be floating the idea that maybe we won't do that after all. So what's the sort of one thing you think can be done in this space, and how can it be consistent with the narrative this government is really putting around all this?
It's a really good question. I mean, I'd be loath to set myself set one fiscal rule, but I would say from where I'm sitting, I think the important thing for her to do is to make sure she doesn't do anything that is seen to break a commitment that she made in the run up to the election or in the manifesto. So we know that they're definitely, I mean, it would be very surprising if they don't reset, if they don't kind of rewrite the fiscal rules in some of the ways that we've been discussing, in one of the ways that we've been discussing. They've really rolled the pitch for that since the party conferences. And actually they've had quite, I mean, you know, there's been quite a lot of positive kind of reception to the idea, and it's something that economists have been calling for a long time, that the current set of fiscal rules is overly restrictive. But you know, I think the challenge for Rachel Reeves is going to be, how do I tweak this in a way that is not going to spark accusations of me breaking a promise, breaking a manifesto commitment, going back on my word, going back on what Labour said it was going to do, because trust in politicians is, you know, absolutely up there as one of the top things that they're worried about. It's already really low, partly because of the last series of governments breaking quite a series of promises. So they're going to have to tread very carefully in that sense.
All right. So I'm. If there are any sort of final questions in the room, any quick burning final questions, it'd be great if we could put the poll results up while people are talking about their final questions. We just have one here at the front. Perhaps we just take these 2 quickly.
Thank you very much for a very interesting event so far. Quick question. Does it seem to make any sense to have an investment summit before you have the budget or spending review? On you asking pieces to by picking a poke somewhat?
All right, Eleni, this is for you, I think.
Yeah, it's a good question. The main reason, the only reason really, what I can see that they've held it now is because they said they would do it in the first 100 days of their government. So that doesn't seem like a good, you know, that does seem to be why it's now rather than after the budget. And that is something that a lot of businesses have been complaining about, because they just don't know, you know, lots of them are waiting to see what happens in the budget. So perhaps not, but because that was something that they said they would do, that's why they're doing it. And you know, I guess on the flip side, one thing that they can do is use the investment summit to pitch roll some announcements, you know, in the way that governments do, kind of drip feed various of the things that they're going to announce in the budget in advance to kind of prepare people for them. I think we can expect today the government to set out some of the promises, some of the policies that it's going to announce, some of the measures. So in that sense, they're kind of giving businesses a kind of bit of a heads up and giving them a bit of a preview, which is one kind of positive thing about the timing.
All right, question here.
So my question is about international investment. So the Prime Minister actually mentioned the global investment facility during the conference. So my question is that how you balance your budget while at the same time you want to maintain your global standing.
Giles,
That's
what a simple question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you do that balancing? Well, I do think you have to take seriously the risks of putting new taxes on capital. It is flighty, and insofar as there needs to be a growth model for this country and enunciated in some way, we need to be an open trading economy that is open to every possible influence, every large market, every sort of idea, and I think that there is a risk when you take the most sort of mobile of all the factors of production, capital, and put too much on it. So they do need to pay some attention to that. But I do think they can achieve an awful lot without necessarily being the most competitive taxation place, including making it much more obvious where you go to if you are an international investor and you want to talk to a minister about a planning issue or a regulatory issue or something like that. It's a real nightmare in this country. It could really be improved, and that doesn't cost a vast amount of money. It just requires a little more central coordination and direction and leadership from the government and a little consistency. So I do think it's possible to square that circle.
All right, let's finish by asking each of the panel members to sum up whether they think the Chancellor can achieve all the things that we have set out, and which she might give up, given the sort of trade-offs. But before we do, just on this fiscal rules question, which 50 people have admirably grappled with, I have to say, Cara has sold you on the net financial liabilities, the PASNUFL or the PASNU. So it's good to see there's some enthusiasm for changing those rules and driving some more investment. So, Eleni, I'm going to come to you first. How optimistic are you about this budget, and what might the Chancellor give up?
I think Rachel Reeves is in a really unenviable position, and I wouldn't want to be trying to tick all the boxes that she is trying to tick to achieve all the things that she's trying to achieve. And that is partly down to Labour itself boxing itself in quite a lot in the run up to this. I think what I would say really is the thing that they could really I don't know if I think she's going to have to try and achieve everything that we've outlined, but the thing that they really need to try and get right is the communication of it. Because, budgets are, voters and the media are going to be looking at the kind of the vibe and the headlines and the kind of big picture. And the government really needs to get that right. And it's something that, communications is something that they've really not done that well in the first 100 days so far. But kind of pitching it in the right way and getting it kind of written up and presented in the right way in the kind of next 2 weeks, and when it happens, it's going to be really essential, because as I was saying at the beginning, it's really their opportunity to reset the narrative and try and create more positivity and improve the popularity with the public.
Final word from you, Giles. How are you feeling?
I think it's an extremely difficult challenge. I would not advise her to do anything that was politically disastrous at this stage, partly because that's been my habit over the years, but also to reference, am I allowed to reference another think tank's output here? The IFS Green Budget of last week. Sorry, okay. some nobody outfit out there last time produced a piece of economic analysis, and it showed the sheer range between the pessimistic and the optimistic scenarios for growth. Growth is still the most important thing. If the Chancellor did something that was politically really risky or hurt people's living standards or went back on a pre-election pledge now, and then later we got slightly better growth outcomes that meant that that dilemma was not going to be apparent in a year's time, she'll be kicking herself forever. And it might be a little bit like the enormous mess the Major government got into in the 90s, where it put VAT on fuel, and then it oversaw one of the greatest expansions we've ever seen and might not have needed to have taken those measures. I think she might be in a similar position, and it's worth hanging on for at least a year to see how things look before doing some of those more difficult things, just holding the fort for now, because I think the public will be patient.
All right, and Cara, last word to you.
Yeah, I think I sort of broadly agree in that there feels like there's some scope to do some of the things they want to do in terms of changing the fiscal framework, doing some borrowing to invest. So it could be a sort of big budget from that perspective. But the side that is, really tough and where there are just no easy decisions is this squaring of the current balance and the decision between sort of essentially welfare spending, departmental spending cuts, and higher taxes, and how they kind of square off those things together. I think that's where it's really tough for the Chancellor. There are no easy ways out.
All right. So let's thank our panel for a really interesting session this morning. And we'll see you all back here on Halloween to see how the budget all went. So thanks everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.